Hello everyone, tonight we're talking about the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the day the US Army thought it was hunting and instead became prey. From cavalrymen scrambling through the river like terrified cattle, to Custer's glorious last stand, that was really more of a chaotic collapse. Two mutilated bodies, left under a sun so hot they swelled like grotesque balloons. This wasn't the noble painting you've seen, it was worse, much worse. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this strange corner of history where arrogance meets annihilation. And I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is as you listen. Now, dim the lights, settle back with something warm, and let the room go quiet. We're going to walk through dust, gunfire, and myth together, all the way to the Little Bighorn. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Not a banker in New York with a pocket watch, not even a farmer sweating over wheat in Kansas. No, you could have been a young cavalryman in the US Army, riding west in 1876, chasing after Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people whose only crime was refusing to hand over their homeland just because some white men got glitter in their eyes in the Black Hills. Yes, gold dust, the great American motivator, right up there with God, glory, and the occasional excuse to shoot at strangers. Picture this: the United States government signs a treaty, says the Black Hills belong to the Lakota forever, and then, about 5 minutes later, miners show up, start digging holes, and Washington shrugs and says, well, forever is such a vague word. Suddenly, reservation policy becomes code for move over. We want the shiny stuff. You'd be part of the machine sent to enforce that eviction notice. The plan looked tidy on paper, a three-pronged campaign. General Crook from the south, Colonel Gibbon from the west, and General Terry with his golden boy, George Armstrong Custer, marching in from the east. Classic military thinking, trap the tribes in a pincer movement. Except there's a small problem. Nobody bothered to notice how many native families were out there. They weren't a ragged few camps. They were tens of thousands strong, the biggest gathering in living memory. Sitting Bull had dreamed it, Crazy Horse had prepared for it, and now all these nations had come together by the Little Bighorn River like it was the Woodstock of resistance. But let's focus on you. Imagine riding west under that Montana sun, dust sticking to your lips, saddle sores reminding you you're not as heroic as the recruitment posters promised. You've been told the campaign will be short, glorious, maybe even easy. The officers keep saying you'll be bringing in hostiles. That's the language. Not families, not communities, not people who had already been pushed around for decades. Just hostiles, as if they were mosquitoes waiting to be swatted. And you know what the higher-ups feared most? Not the warriors' numbers, not the terrain. No, they feared boredom. Soldiers on campaign were restless, hungry, drunk when they could be, and always gossiping about Custer. The man had a reputation, half hero, half disaster, entirely impossible hair. You'd hear whispers that he thought this campaign would be his ticket back into the national spotlight, maybe even into the White House one day. Because who wouldn't vote for a man who just beat the Plains tribes into submission? You'd ride forward not knowing the full truth, that the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho weren't hiding, weren't retreating, weren't crumbling. They were massing. They had more warriors than your entire regiment had bullets, but you didn't know that. What you knew was what the army wanted you to know, that this was just another step in civilizing the West. So there you are, dusty sore, and already regretting your career choice, marching toward a river in Montana, where the United States was about to get the most humiliating reality check in its military history. And here's the cruelest irony. You still thought you were the hunter. Now, what happens when the hunted suddenly turn out to be 10 times your size, 10 times your speed, and entirely uninterested in being politely rounded up? Well, that's where we're headed next. So there you are, trotting toward the Little Bighorn, saddle creaking, probably humming whatever song soldiers hummed in 1876 when they were bored and sunburned. And the officers keep telling you the same bedtime story. Don't worry, these villages are small. Maybe a few hundred warriors, nothing the 7th Cavalry can't handle. Charming, right? Except it was a fairy tale, and you were about to wake up inside the nightmare. Let me put it plainly. If you'd been there, you weren't riding toward some ragged campfire with a handful of tipis. You were riding toward the largest native encampment on the northern plains in living memory. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho families all together, not scattered, not hiding, but gathered in a massive circle of lodges along the river. Think thousands of people, not hundreds. Women, children, elders, warriors, a full community. And among them, somewhere in the smoke and dust, was Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, which in plains terms was like saying Michael Jordan and Muhammad Ali just teamed up. The numbers. Custer's scouts estimated maybe 800 warriors at most. Cute guess. In reality, closer to 1,500, maybe 2,000, depending on which historian you ask. That's not a skirmish. That's a small city of resistance, armed, mounted, and deeply motivated. Imagine riding in with 5 companies of cavalry, only to discover you've volunteered for the historical equivalent of walking into a bar fight where everyone else brought an axe. And these weren't just warriors fighting for sport. They weren't bandits looking for loot. They were men defending their families, their way of life, and the last stretch of land not yet stripped away by treaties that evaporated faster than whiskey in an officer's tent. Every tipi you saw wasn't just housing, it was a reason to fight to the death. The sheer scale should have been obvious. The pony herds alone stretched for miles, thousands of horses grazing in the grasslands, so many that they looked like dark waves moving against the prairie. Scouts who actually paid attention reported back wide-eyed, muttering that this wasn't a camp, it was an empire on the move. But by the time that information crawled up the chain of command, it was too late. And here's the cruel comedy. Sitting Bull hadn't even planned on fighting in the conventional sense. He was a spiritual leader, more likely to be conducting ceremonies than swinging a club. He had dreamed, literally dreamed of soldiers falling into the camp like grasshoppers from the sky. The people believed him, and that belief was worth more than any Springfield rifle. Crazy Horse, meanwhile, was all business. He wasn't making speeches. He was preparing warriors, sharpening tactics, using the terrain. When the moment came, he wouldn't hesitate. If you had been in Custer's boots, maybe you'd have paused. Maybe you'd have said, "Gentlemen, that sure looks like more lodges than we were promised." But Custer didn't pause. He pressed on. The bigger the camp, the bigger the glory, at least in his head. The thing about glory, though, is it looks much shinier before it's soaked in your regiment's blood. So you, the loyal soldier, kept riding, blissfully unaware that the enemy wasn't shrinking, wasn't running, wasn't afraid. They were waiting, and not politely. And this is the part where the story stops being about underestimating numbers and starts being about leadership decisions so questionable you'd think they were written by a comedy writer. Now, let's put you in Custer's saddle for a moment. Blonde curls, flashy uniform, the kind of man who thought humility was a disease other people had. You'd already built your fame in the Civil War by charging headfirst into battles with more luck than sense. And now you're convinced this campaign is your encore, the show that puts your name back on America's lips, maybe even the White House someday. After all, who doesn't love a war hero who also looks like he's auditioning for a cologne ad? So what do you do when you reach the Little Bighorn? You split your regiment into 3 parts, of course, because nothing screams confidence like dividing 600 men against a force 2 or 3 times their size. You've got Reno heading south, bent in off scouting, and you with your personal detachment of about 210 men charging north. It's as if you saw the enemy camp, rubbed your hands together, and thought, perfect, they'll never expect me to attack with fewer soldiers. Spoiler, they expected it. And let's not forget the little details that history loves to keep embarrassing. Custer refused the offer of Gatling guns, big, crank-operated beasts that could spit out bullets faster than a drunk lieutenant at confession. Why? Too heavy, too slow, not glorious enough. He also turned down reinforcements, because who wants more men when you could have more headlines? Meanwhile, you're telling your officers that speed is everything. Surprise them, strike fast, seize the women and children, and the warriors will collapse. That's the plan. Kidnap the families, force the surrender. It's as cold as it is stupid. What actually happened was that you poked a hornet's nest, and instead of scattering, the hornets organized themselves into a disciplined cavalry with better horses than yours. If you'd been there, riding under Custer's banner, you'd have seen his confidence infect the ranks. Men joked, laughed, believed in the legend. That's the thing about charisma. It works right up until reality walks in and starts throwing spears. Some of his scouts, Crow and Arikara allies, warned him. They saw the size of the village, saw the pony herds, and muttered that this was suicide. Custer brushed them off. He believed numbers didn't matter when destiny was on your side. Destiny, unfortunately, doesn't reload carbines for you when you're surrounded. It's easy, now, to laugh at the hubris, the sheer theatrical arrogance of the man. But in the moment, those decisions weren't comedy, they were death sentences. Splitting his force meant Reno would panic alone, Benteen would arrive late and resentful, and Custer himself would march into the history books, not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale in poor planning. So there you are, galloping forward under a sun that feels like a magnifying glass, the river glinting below, the air thick with dust. You don't know it yet, but you're riding into a place that will later be called Last Stand Hill. You don't know that the rifles are going to jam, that the warriors are going to encircle you, that your name will be carved, not in glory but in epitaphs. For now, you just trust Custer, because that's what soldiers do. Trust the man with the curls, trust the plan that's already unraveling. And what happens next is the first unraveling thread, Reno's charge. So here's where you, loyal cavalryman, finally get some action. Custer, in his infinite brilliance, sends Major Marcus Reno down toward the southern end of the great encampment. Your job: cross the little Bighorn River, ride hard, and smash straight into the village. Sounds simple enough when a man with shiny buttons is barking orders. What you don't realize is that you're basically being volunteered as the opening act in a play where the audience has brought knives. Imagine it, June heat pounding your skull, horses splashing through the river, carbines raised. Reno leads about 140 men, dust rising like a storm behind you, and for a second you almost believe the legend. The warriors scatter at first, families rushing, children screaming, the camp in motion. It looks like victory, but it's a trick of the eye. The camp wasn't running, it was mobilizing. The first wave of resistance hits quick. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, mounted bareback, darting in and out like hornets. You've never seen horsemanship like this. No rigid formations, no bugle calls, just fluid, living chaos. Their ponies stop and start on a dime, arrows and bullets slicing through the dust. Suddenly, the neat lines of the 7th Cavalry look clumsy, like a brass band trying to play a duet with a thunderstorm. Reno calls for a skirmish line. Men dismount, spread out, start firing. Carbines crack, smoke fills the air. You're sweating, choking, heart pounding. For 20 minutes it feels like maybe, just maybe, this will hold. But more warriors keep pouring in. Dozens become hundreds. Crazy Horse himself is somewhere in the fray, directing the charge with that unshakable calm that makes you wish your own officers had skipped fewer whiskey breakfasts. Then Reno makes a decision that history will never forgive. He orders a retreat into the timber along the riverbank. The idea is to regroup, buy time. Instead, it turns into a panic. Horses rear, men shout, formations dissolve. Warriors swarm from the river, from the grass, from every direction. The retreat is more like a sprint for survival. If you'd been there, you'd have felt the shift in your gut, the precise moment when a charge turns into a rout. You're running through thick brush, boots catching, water splashing, men screaming behind you. Bullets whistle, arrows thud. Some men fall and never rise. Others cling to their saddles, eyes wide, firing blindly over their shoulders. It's not gallantry, it's terror on horseback. When Reno's battered survivors finally stagger onto the bluffs overlooking the river, they're half mad with exhaustion. Dozens are dead already, and the rest know they barely escaped being wiped out entirely. They dig in, trembling, waiting for orders that sound less suicidal. Reno, shaken, pale, suddenly less a commander and more a man desperately trying to look like one. And here's the cruel irony. While Reno's men are bleeding and gasping on that hilltop, Custer is still charging north, blissfully unaware that his southern wing has already cracked. That's the problem with splitting your force in hostile territory. News doesn't travel faster than a bullet. So there you sit on Reno Hill, ears ringing, mouth dry, knowing the camp below isn't broken at all, it's boiling. And someone else, poor Benteen, is about to get dragged into the mess. If you were lucky enough not to be drowning in Reno's panic just now, then maybe you were riding with Captain Frederick Benteen. His orders: swing off to the left, scout the bluffs and valleys to the south, make sure no warriors were sneaking around. Translation: go wander in circles while the real action starts without you. And Benteen did just that, trotting leisurely across empty hills, grumbling about the terrain, stopping to water horses, all while the sound of gunfire rolled faintly in the distance like thunder. You pretend not to notice. Let's be fair, Benteen was no fool. He despised Custer, and not quietly. Thought him reckless, vain, a gambler with men's lives. And here he was, ordered to detach from the main column on the eve of battle, which to Benteen smelled suspiciously like being sent out of the way so Custer could hog the glory. So when he finally got a courier with Custer's frantic note, "Come quick, bring packs," Benteen didn't exactly break the land speed record. Picture him, sitting his horse, reading the note, scowling. "Come quick" sounded like Custer finally realizing the hornet's nest was bigger than advertised, and bring packs meant the slow-moving mule train carrying extra ammunition. Without it, the men would be dry in minutes. Benteen looked at the trail behind him, mules stumbling, soldiers cursing, and he knew rushing ahead would mean leaving the ammo in the dust. And what good's a carbine with an empty chamber? So he chose caution. He slowed. He waited for the packs. He muttered about how this was Custer's mess anyway. The delay became fatal. By the time Benteen linked up with Reno's shattered survivors on the bluffs, the battle to the north had already reached the point of no return. Now, if you had been there, you would have felt the tension hanging thick in the air on Reno Hill. Men digging rifle pits with bayonets, horses foaming, officers yelling, "Huff!" When Benteen rode up, some cursed him for taking so long, others silently thanked him for arriving at all. He brought a steady hand, and yes, the badly needed ammunition. But he also brought confirmation. Nobody had seen Custer. Nobody knew where he was. And here's where the acid humor of history kicks in. Reno and Benteen now had about 350 men between them, a battered, half-coherent force clinging to the high ground. They were under fire, surrounded, terrified. And Custer, he was still out there, cut off, with 210 men staring down a force that outnumbered him by at least 5-1. Benteen could have pushed north to help him, but after seeing Reno's disaster, he stayed put. Protect the survivors. Let Custer fend for himself. The debate still rages. Was Benteen's delay an act of cowardice, or was it the only rational choice in an unwinnable situation? If you'd been standing in his boots, watching Reno's men crumble, you might have made the same call. But history is cruel. It doesn't care about prudence. It remembers that while Benteen hesitated, Custer died. So there you sit on the hill, gunfire echoing from the north, smoke rising in the distance, and a gnawing certainty growing in your gut. Whatever was happening to Custer's battalion out there, it wasn't victory, it was slaughter. And soon, you'll see how fast slaughter can move when it has horses, rifles, and Crazy Horse himself leading the charge. So while Reno's men were being peeled off the riverbank like wet wallpaper and Benteen was busy perfecting the art of slow arrival, you, unlucky soul, were with Custer himself, 210 troopers riding north, dust choking your throat, sun hammering your helmet, and that famous golden-haired commander at the front, like a man convinced he could bend destiny with sheer confidence. Custer had seen the sheer size of the native village, row after row of lodges, smoke rising, children scattering, pony herds stretching like living tides across the prairie, and his plan: cut them off at the north end, seize the women and children, force the warriors to surrender. Because nothing says sound strategy like trying to hold thousands of civilians hostage with fewer men than it takes to staff a small post office. If you'd been there, you'd have watched the column snake along the ridges, the little Bighorn glinting below. The scouts Crow and Arikara allies looked uneasy, whispering warnings that this was suicide. Some even slipped away before the fight began. They'd seen enough battles to know what a trap looked like. But Custer, he pressed on, always forward, always convinced that boldness was its own form of armor. When the first wave of warriors appeared, it was like shadows materializing from the grass. Hundreds of them, riding low, darting quick, rifles flashing. You fired, they scattered, only to reappear on your flank, behind you, everywhere at once. Their ponies turned tighter than your cavalry horses, their movements more fluid, more instinctive. The neat rows of the 7th Cavalry disintegrated into broken knots of men, trying desperately to hold ground that didn't want to be held. Custer tried to split the companies, sending some toward the river, others to higher ridges. But everywhere you turned, more warriors poured in. Crazy Horse led one of the great charges of his life, sweeping around like a storm. The warriors didn't just outnumber you, they outmaneuvered you. They rode circles, cut off escape routes, fired from cover you didn't even see until the bullets hit. Imagine kneeling in the dirt, carbine shaking in your hands, trying to load while the world around you collapses. Horses screaming, men shouting prayers or curses, dust and smoke thick enough to choke on. You're firing at shapes you can barely see, and every time you reload there are fewer men beside you. Some tried to hold skirmish lines, others broke for the river. Most died before they could move more than a few yards. And Custer, he didn't lead a glorious charge. He didn't deliver heroic speeches. He was trapped like everyone else. His companies collapsing under the weight of numbers. His legend was dying in real time, long before it got polished into the myth of the last stand. By now, you would have realized this wasn't a battle at all. It was an encirclement, a collapse. Every ridge that promised safety became another killing ground. Every retreat was cut off before it began. You weren't facing a scattered enemy. You were facing a coordinated defense of an entire nation, and you were badly, hopelessly out of place. And if you thought it couldn't get worse, well, it could. Because the encirclement was only the beginning. What came next was panic, chaos, and the kind of last resistance that doesn't look anything like the oil paintings. If you'd made it this far with Custer, congratulations, you were already standing on ground that historians would later nickname Last Stand Hill. Only it wasn't noble, it wasn't cinematic, and it sure as hell wasn't orderly. It was a choke point, a shallow ridge surrounded on all sides. The kind of place where men dig in, not because it's defensible, but because they've run out of road. The warriors moved like water filling a basin. Lakota and Cheyenne riders poured in from every direction, flooding the ridges, cutting off the river, surrounding every angle. You could have sworn the prairie itself had come alive with gunfire. And unlike you, they weren't trapped. They could dart in, fire, retreat, circle back, charge again. They had the numbers, the mobility, and the momentum. All you had was a shrinking patch of dirt and a pile of empty cartridges. Carbines cracked, but the rate of fire slowed. The Springfield trapdoors the cavalry carried were sturdy but slow to reload, and in the chaos, many jammed. Imagine fumbling for cartridges with shaking hands while riders swooped past, bullets and arrows ripping into the line. Every minute, another gap opened. Another man fell, screaming. Another position buckled. Custer's men tried to form skirmish lines, dismounted, kneeling, firing from cover if they could find it. But cover was scarce on that ridge. The warriors had the advantage of terrain, gullies, ridges, grass, high enough to crawl through unseen. You were exposed, crouched behind the body of your horse, praying its bulk would stop a bullet. And here's the bitter truth. The last stand wasn't one dramatic moment where the flag waved defiantly until the final shot. It was collapse by degrees. Clusters of men broke apart, some retreating downslope, only to be cut down before they reached the river. Others clung to the hilltop, firing until they were swarmed. The air was a blur of dust, powder, smoke, and screams that didn't sound like soldiers anymore. They sounded like boys. Custer himself likely died early in the fight. Maybe a bullet to the chest, maybe one to the head. The reports differ. What's clear is that once he fell, the cohesion evaporated. Officers dropped, sergeants shouted themselves hoarse, and the rank and file fought alone, in small, desperate pockets. The notion of command dissolved into raw survival. From a distance you might have seen crazy horses charge, sweep the field, warriors darting in with rifles, lances, war clubs. Up close, it was chaos. A man trying to reload gets trampled. Another swings his rifle like a club, before disappearing under hooves. Horses scream, wounded and riderless, bolting through the melee. The world narrowed 2 seconds, each one more frantic than the last. And then, silence. Not the silence of peace, but the stunned stillness after slaughter. The ridge was carpeted with bodies, blue uniforms torn and bloody, weapons scattered. A few soldiers may have made desperate dashes into ravines, but none escaped. 210 men marched north with Custer. 210 men died there. If you'd been there, you'd have realized the collapse wasn't just tactical, it was spiritual. The myth of us invincibility on the plains bled out in that dust, and the memory of it would haunt both sides. The victors who knew retribution would come, and the defeated who would turn the massacre into myth. But before myth could be written, there was the reality, chaos, blood, and the final, desperate resistance of men who knew they'd been abandoned. If you'd survived the first waves, crouched behind a dying horse, or scrambling through dust, this is the part where you'd feel the world shrink to a few square yards of panic. Forget neat battle lines and bugle calls. This was chaos distilled. Men tried to rally, but there was no rallying. They fired until their rifles jammed, then swung them like clubs. They drew pistols, emptying them in seconds, then hurled the useless weight at whoever was charging next. Some broke for the river, desperate to escape, but the valley below was already sealed. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors waited, riding hard into the gaps, cutting men down before they reached the water. Others tried climbing to higher ground, clawing up ridges only to find themselves silhouetted targets against the sky. It wasn't a retreat, it was a scattering. Each pocket of resistance became another circle collapsing under sheer weight. And here's the part no oil painting ever gets right. There was no single heroic stand, no flag waving until the last man fell in glorious defiance. The evidence on the ground tells a different story. Men dying in clusters, sprawled in ravines, cut off in 2s and 3s. Some stripped of weapons, others clearly killed while fleeing. The last stand was marketing. The truth was confusion. Custer's own brothers were there. Tom and Boston cut down along with him. Officers who'd swaggered in their boots now lay face down in the dust beside privates who'd never fired a shot in anger before that day. Horses bolted wild across the field, dragging broken tack, hooves pounding the earth like war drums. And over it all, the cries of warriors surged and broke like waves, relentless, unanswerable. Some soldiers tried to surrender, tossing weapons aside, raising hands. But this wasn't a battlefield governed by the Geneva Conventions. The Lakota and Cheyenne weren't interested in collecting prisoners. They were eliminating a threat to their families. Surrender meant nothing when your opponent had spent years watching treaties broken, villages burned, children slaughtered. Mercy wasn't part of the script that day. The fighting was brutal, close, and final. Lances and clubs swung as easily as rifles fired. Arrows thudded into bodies, finishing what bullets began. Imagine the dust, the choking powder smoke, the sun glaring down while the air itself seemed to tear apart with noise. Your world would have been a circle of men screaming, firing, falling, until there was nothing left but silence and the smell of blood and gunpowder. And then came the aftermath, the part soldiers feared most. Many bodies were mutilated, not out of sadism, but out of cultural tradition. To count coup was to mark victory, to prevent an enemy's spirit from returning to fight again. Fingers severed, scalps taken, clothes stripped. Some men's faces were unrecognizable when burial details finally arrived. The only exception, Custer himself. His body was pierced with bullets, yes, but left otherwise intact. Whether it was respect for his bravery, contempt for his arrogance, or just chance, no one can say for certain. If you'd been lying there, bleeding into the dirt, you'd have known one thing with absolute clarity. Nobody was coming. Benteen was too far. Reno was cowering on the bluffs, and the only help in sight was the vultures already circling overhead. And as the dust settled, as the warriors pulled back to regroup, you'd have realized the cavalry wasn't just defeated. It was erased. A battalion vanished in less than an hour. But of course, victory doesn't come without its own price. Even in triumph, the warriors counted their own dead, and the camp itself bore witness to blood. If you were standing in the aftermath, not as a soldier in blue, but as one of the Lakota or Cheyenne warriors brushing blood and dust from your arms, you'd have felt the strange silence that always follows a storm. The field below was littered with uniforms and broken bodies, horses foaming and staggering, the grass trampled flat. Victory hung heavy in the air, but it wasn't clean. It never is. The native warriors had won, decisively, and at staggering odds. 210 US soldiers annihilated, 5 companies erased, but it hadn't been bloodless. Depending on which account you trust, somewhere between 40 and 100 warriors were killed, many more wounded. To a people fighting for their very survival, those numbers mattered. Every warrior lost was a brother, father, husband, another hole torn into a community that had already given so much to keep its land. And the way they fought, it wasn't the disorganized frenzy later painted in dime novels. It was strategy. Sitting Bull had provided the vision, his Sundance prophecy convincing the people that soldiers would fall into their camp like grasshoppers. Crazy Horse and other leaders turned that faith into tactics. Encircle, outflank, cut off escape routes. The warriors rode not as ragged individuals, but as a wave, each charge feeding the next. If you'd been there, you wouldn't have seen chaos. You'd have seen choreography written in dust and blood. Families in the encampment had seen everything. Women ran to drag children to safety. Elders beat drums and sang prayers. Some women even joined the fight once the soldiers were broken, seizing weapons, striking blows. When the last gunshots faded, the village wasn't cheering like some parade crowd. It was breathing hard, trembling with the knowledge of what had just happened. They had defeated the United States Army in open battle. And let's pause here for irony. The US government had called these people hostiles, savages, unworthy of land, rights, or dignity. Yet on that day, those so-called hostiles had stood against trained soldiers, armed with superior firepower, and not only held their ground, but utterly destroyed an entire wing of the 7th Cavalry. If you'd been a warrior there, you would have felt the triumph in your chest, not pride in slaughter, but relief, vindication, proof that the earth, the spirits, the ancestors, still stood with you. But victory has a shadow. Even in triumph, the people knew this would draw vengeance. They had struck the United States where it hurt most, humiliated Custer, shattered a regiment, sent shockwaves eastward. The celebrations were tempered with dread. Sitting Bull himself warned that the fight was not the end but the beginning of a much larger storm. Still, for one shining moment, it was a victory unlike any other. Warriors rode back into camp, painted, bloodied, alive. Songs were sung, coups counted, stories told by firelight. They had defended their families, their homeland, their right to exist. They had fought off one of the most famous officers in America and left him in the dust. If you'd been there, breathing in the smoke and sweat, you'd have known it was history. A victory that would echo across the plains and terrify the halls of Washington. And the terror was justified, because soon the headlines would roar and the US Army would come back with everything it had. But before that reckoning, the battlefield itself had to be faced by those who came late and saw only horror. Now imagine you weren't with Custer's doomed column at all. You were with Reno and Benteen hunkered down on the bluffs, sweating through the night as warriors circled, firing from every ridge. You'd already seen men panic, die, and vanish in the dust. And then, after hours of waiting, the gunfire to the north stopped. The smoke thinned, the echoes died. You might have told yourself that meant Custer had triumphed, that he'd broken through and forced the village to scatter. Hope is a stubborn parasite like that. But hope doesn't last when scouts ride back with the news. They're all down. Every last man who followed Custer, North officers, sergeants, privates, musicians, even the civilian packers and guides, dead. 210 bodies, wiped off the map in less than an hour. If you'd been there, you'd have felt the air go hollow in your lungs. Not just defeat, annihilation. The numbers were obscene. 268 soldiers killed in the entire battle, including Custer and 15 of his officers. 5 full companies gone without a survivor to tell the tale. The US Army hadn't lost a fight like this in living memory. It wasn't a setback. It was humiliation carved into the earth. When relief finally arrived 2 days later, General Terry's column coming in cautiously, rifles ready, they found what you'd never want to see. The battlefield after 2 hot summer days. Bodies stripped, bloated, mutilated by both ritual and nature. Horses lying stiff, tack broken, gear scattered. They found Custer's corpse, pierced by 2 bullets but otherwise left untouched. Nearby, his brothers Tom and Boston, his brother-in-law James Calhoun, clustered together in death. It looked less like a military action and more like the aftermath of a natural disaster. Sudden, total, merciless. The survivors with Reno and Benteen were gaunt, sleepless, traumatized. They'd spent 2 days under siege, pinned on a hill, drinking muddy water, digging shallow rifle pits with spoons and tin cups. They hadn't seen Custer's fate directly, but they didn't need to. They could smell it on the wind. And here's where history gets particularly cruel. Back east, people didn't want to hear about chaos, panic, or bad decisions. They wanted heroes. So the story that spread wasn't Custer divided his forces and got everyone killed. It was Custer's last stand, a noble band of brothers fighting to the last cartridge against impossible odds. Paintings showed him upright, pistol blazing, flag waving, hair shining like a divine halo. No mention of men breaking for the river. No mention of Reno's route. No mention of Benteen's slow crawl. Just glory, cleaned up and gift-wrapped for a public that preferred myths to reality. But if you'd been there, standing on that bluff, or walking through the carnage afterward, you wouldn't have seen glory. You'd have seen the cost of arrogance, the cost of underestimating your enemy, overestimating your commander, and marching blind into a trap that everyone but Custer seemed to sense was coming. The shockwaves didn't stop at the battlefield. They rolled east, into newspapers, into the halls of government, into the hearts of families who'd just lost sons, brothers, husbands, and in those halls, humiliation quickly hardened into fury. Because defeat this public, this bloody, this undeniable, well, it doesn't end with reflection, it ends with revenge. If you'd arrived with Terry's relief column, 2 days after the guns fell silent, you'd have wished you hadn't. The battlefield wasn't just a graveyard, it was a canvas of horror painted by sun, flies, and ritual. Imagine riding up over the ridges, the stench hitting before the sight. Then you see it. Blue uniforms torn and scattered, bodies bloated in the heat, skin darkened, hair matted, eyes gone. Horses sprawled on their sides, tack twisted, their bellies swelling like grotesque balloons. The little Bighorn didn't whisper, it screamed. The soldiers' bodies told a story that no romantic painting ever would. Many were stripped naked, clothing and gear taken, either as spoils of war or because cloth was valuable. Some were scalped, others mutilated. Fingers hacked off to take rings, faces slashed to mark coup. One man found with his head crushed, another pierced through with dozens of arrows, long after he'd fallen. It wasn't sadism in the Hollywood sense. It was cultural practice, the warriors ensuring that an enemy's spirit couldn't return to haunt them. But to you, standing there, it would have looked like a massacre had gone on long after death. Custer's body was different. He lay with 2 bullet wounds, one to the chest, one to the head. His hair cropped short before the battle, his buckskin stripped, but his body otherwise left alone. Was it respect, contempt, sheer accident? No one can say. What's certain is that his famous golden locks weren't glowing that day. They were gone, along with the illusion of invincibility he'd carried into the fight. For the men sent to bury the dead, the work was unbearable. They had to dig shallow graves with whatever tools they had, often just hands and knives, under a punishing Montana sun. The soil was thin, rocky. Many bodies couldn't be buried properly. They were laid in trenches, dirt heaped over them quickly, the smell lingering, the flies swarming. Soldiers gagged, some vomited, others worked in grim silence, shoveling dust onto men they'd drunk with, marched with, cursed alongside. And the scene wasn't just grotesque, it was humiliating. This was the US Army, the great banner of expansion, the hammer of the frontier, reduced to bones and flies in less than a day. The 7th Cavalry hadn't just lost, it had been shredded, desecrated, erased. Every mutilated body was a reminder that the enemy hadn't been cowed, savages but determined warriors who'd fought for their homes and won. If you'd been there, you wouldn't have thought of heroism. You'd have thought of the silence between the cries of the crows, the smell that clung to your skin, the sight of men's faces half gone. And you'd have known this wasn't just another battle to write in the ledger. It was a stain that no amount of patriotic spin could wash out. Of course, back east, they tried. Newspapers spoke of gallantry, of noble death. But on the ground, among the shallow graves and the buzzing flies, there was no gallantry. There was only the awful intimacy of death, close, personal, and unforgettable. And yet, that horror was quickly turned into fuel. Because when a nation sees its soldiers butchered, stripped, and mutilated, it doesn't ask why. It asks how fast it can strike back. Now, if you hadn't been on the battlefield gagging over shallow graves and mutilated corpses, but instead was sitting in a Boston parlor with your morning newspaper, you'd have read something very different. Not chaos, not panic, not Renault's cowardly retreat or Bentine's questionable delay. No, the headlines told you about Custer's last stand, a shining legend born out of failure before the bodies were even cold. The press loved it. A whole regiment wiped out, catastrophic, yes, but also perfect for selling papers. And what sells better than tragedy spun into martyrdom? Artists painted Custer upright on a hill, saber raised, curls golden in the sun, standing tall as his men fell around him. Noble, defiant, heroic, a Greek tragedy on the prairie. Never mind that he probably died early in the fight, shot through the chest or head before he had time for speeches. Details are bad for morale. Back east, the army needed a narrative too. You can't admit that arrogance, poor planning, and underestimating your enemy led to disaster. That makes the government look weak. So they leaned hard into myth. Custer wasn't reckless. He was courageous. His men didn't panic. They fought to the last cartridge. They didn't die because the Lakota and Cheyenne were better fighters in that moment. They died because fate demanded sacrifice. That's the version carved into patriotic sermons, oil paintings, and dime novels. And what about Reno's route, Bentine's hesitation, the raw, unvarnished chaos? Those details got shoved into footnotes or buried under layers of military inquiry that ended with the same conclusion. Don't blame the army. Don't blame the plan. Don't blame the policy. Blame the dead man with the golden hair. Custer became both the villain and the saint, a convenient scapegoat wrapped in martyr's clothing. Meanwhile, the native side of the story was pushed into silence. Their victory wasn't celebrated as tactical genius or a defense of homeland. It was condemned as savagery, a massacre, proof that these people were dangerous and needed to be crushed. Newspapers lingered on mutilations, on scalping, on cultural practices that horrified Victorian sensibilities. The subtext was clear. If this is what they do to our boys, then extermination isn't cruelty, it's justice. If you'd been there, flipping through the headlines in New York or Philadelphia, you'd have thought the 7th Cavalry died as saints and the Lakota and Cheyenne as demons. You wouldn't have heard about Crazy Horse's tactical brilliance, or Sitting Bull's prophecy, or the fact that women and children were in the camp fighting for their very existence. You'd have heard about Custer's courage, about the flag that never fell, about civilization battling barbarism on the frontier. And isn't that the cruel joke of history? The messier the defeat, the prettier the myth, the worse the reality, the faster it's painted over with oil and gold leaf. Custer's last stand wasn't history. It was advertising, a way to soothe national pride, to cover humiliation with heroism, to make sure the taxpayers kept funding the wars. But propaganda has teeth. Those myths weren't just stories. They became fuel. Because when you tell a nation that its men were slaughtered by savages, and you polish the dead into martyrs, the next step isn't reflection, it's retribution. If you'd been one of the lucky few still alive on Reno Hill, swatting flies and sipping mud water while waiting for Terry's column to save you, you might have thought the defeat at Little Bighorn would make the government pause, reflect, maybe even ask, why are we shoving thousands of people off their land for gold? But you'd be wrong, very wrong. Washington didn't pause, it doubled down. Back east, the news hit like an earthquake. 268 U.S. soldiers gone in a single battle. An entire battalion wiped from the army rolls. Politicians didn't read that as time to rethink policy. They read it as time to teach these tribes a lesson so brutal nobody will ever resist. Again, the ink was barely dry on the casualty lists before more troops were mobilized. The Great Sioux War of 1876, that's what they called it, became the national obsession. If you'd been Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse in those days after the victory, you'd have known the celebration was already haunted. Yes, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had won the greatest victory of their lifetimes, but victory carried a curse. The United States Army had been humiliated in public, and nothing enrages an empire faster than embarrassment. Custer's defeat wasn't seen as a battle. It was treated like an insult to the entire republic. Within weeks, the army swelled on the plains. Generals Sheridan, Terry Crook, they all came back with reinforcements. Thousands of soldiers, better supplied, better coordinated, armed with fury and the justification of avenged Custer. Even those slow Gatling guns that Custer had arrogantly left behind were rolled out now. The hunting season on native resistance was officially open, and it had no bag limit. And Congress, it used the shock to ram through what it had wanted all along. The Black Hills, treaty or not. The Sioux were told to surrender the region immediately. It didn't matter that the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie had guaranteed it forever. After Little Bighorn, forever got legally redefined to mean until we find gold. By 1877, the Black Hills were formally seized. Forever lasted 9 years. So, while you were back on Reno Hill thanking heaven you survived, the wheels of retribution were already turning. Crazy Horse would be hunted down, cornered, and killed by 1877. Sitting Bull, chased into Canada, would eventually be forced to surrender and return south, a shadow of his former power. The massive encampment at Little Bighorn that once stood as a symbol of unity scattered families, starving as the buffalo herds were destroyed, warriors cut off from supplies, children sent to agencies that looked more like prisons than sanctuaries. That's the grim irony. The greatest native victory on the plains didn't preserve freedom. It accelerated the loss. By humiliating the United States Army, the tribes ensured the government would throw every ounce of manpower and money into crushing them once and for all. The scale of the retaliation made survival impossible. If you'd been their soldier or warrior, you would have felt the same truth from different sides. For the army, vengeance was destiny. For the tribes, victory was fleeting. The battle was won, yes. But the war, as history would prove, was lost in the very moment of triumph. And that's what makes Little Bighorn less a story of glory and more a story of inevitability. Because the next chapters weren't about celebration. They were about survival in a world that had already decided who was allowed to keep the land. If you'd been in the camp that summer day, not wearing blue wool but wrapped in a buffalo robe, hearing the drumbeats and the cries of children as soldiers thundered into view, your memory of Little Bighorn would be nothing like the stories told back east. You wouldn't have called it Custer's last stand. You'd have called it what it was, the defense of your home. From the native perspective, the soldiers weren't noble knights of empire. They were invaders, men who'd already burned villages, killed families, and broken treaties that promised safety in the Black Hills. They weren't bringing civilization. They were bringing rifles and orders to shove your people into agencies where food was scarce, disease spread, and freedom evaporated. So when they rode across the river, guns raised, they weren't messengers of progress. They were another column of danger to be stopped. And stopped they were. Accounts from Lakota and Cheyenne warriors don't talk about facing an organized juggernaut. They talk about soldiers panicking, lines collapsing, men firing wildly. Warriors remembered how easy it was to ride among them, how quickly they scattered. Some said the soldiers died running. Others described them huddled in confusion, not glorious in defiance, but broken in fear. But there was also pride, enormous pride. Crazy Horse's charge was remembered as one of the defining moments of the fight. Sitting Bull's vision, received during his Sundance, seemed to have come alive. Soldiers falling into the camp like grasshoppers, swarming, then destroyed. For those who believed in the power of dreams and visions, this wasn't coincidence. It was proof that the spirits still favored their cause, that the old ways still carried strength. The women remembered too, not as silent witnesses, but as participants. Some helped carry water, tend the wounded, and move children out of harm's way. Others fought directly when the soldiers collapsed, seizing weapons from fallen men and striking blows of their own. In native oral histories, the victory wasn't just the warriors, it belonged to the whole camp. And yet, woven into those stories, there's an undercurrent of sorrow. The dead were counted. Songs were sung for them. The loss of even a handful of warriors mattered more to these communities than the destruction of hundreds of soldiers did to the U.S. Army. For the tribes, every life was part of the circle, each death a wound in the web of kinship. Victory was never clean. If you'd been there, watching the smoke drift away and the soldiers' bodies cooling in the sun, you'd have felt both triumph and dread. Triumph because the invaders had been stopped so completely. Dread because everyone knew what came next. This wasn't the kind of defeat an empire shrugs off. It was the kind of humiliation that brings more armies, more guns, more hunger. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, Little Bighorn became a moment of shining resistance, proof that courage and unity could strike even the mightiest enemy. But it was also remembered as the last great victory before the storm of vengeance. Oral histories carry both notes, pride in what was done, sorrow in what it unleashed. So when you strip away the myths, the oil paintings, the schoolbook legends, what's left is this: the people who lived it didn't fight for drama or glory. They fought because they had no choice, because the river, the lodges, the herds, the very earth under their feet demanded it. And for one day, they won. But history doesn't end on a single day, does it? The battlefield may have echoed with songs of triumph, but the horizon already carried the shadow of what was coming. If you died there on the banks of the Little Bighorn, the story of your life wouldn't have belonged to you anymore. It would have been stolen, rewritten, polished, and paraded. That's the cruel thing about legacies. They're not built on what you lived, but on what others decide to remember. And in this case, memory split like the river itself. Two channels, two truths, neither quite whole. For the United States, The battle became mythology almost overnight. Custer's last stand was painted, sung, and dramatized until schoolchildren could recite it like scripture. It didn't matter that the facts were twisted. The image of heroic soldiers dying in defiance sold papers, stirred patriotism, and justified policy. Custer became both scapegoat and saint, blamed for mistakes, but also worshipped as the martyr who symbolized civilization's struggle against the so-called wilderness. You, the nameless private who bled out in the grass, were background noise. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the memory was sharper, closer to the bone. Little Bighorn was proof that resistance wasn't futile, that the old ways still had power. Oral histories carried the voices of warriors who rode circles around bluecoats, of women who struck blows with captured rifles, of Crazy Horse leading the charge like lightning incarnate. The story was retold with pride, but also with sorrow, because everyone knew what followed. Within a year, Crazy Horse was dead, Sitting Bull fled to Canada, and the buffalo were vanishing faster than prayers could be spoken. Victory had been real, but so was the price. And then came the historians, the storytellers, the archaeologists. They picked over the battlefield, dug up cartridges, mapped where bodies had fallen, argued over Custer's last moments. Was he brave? Was he foolish? Did his men stand or scatter? Every generation added a new coat of interpretation, as if the dead were exhibits in a debate club. Meanwhile, the land itself, the ridges, the river, the grass that grows back every spring, kept the truest memory, quiet and unstable. If you'd visited the site today, you'd find two sets of memorials. One to the 7th Cavalry, names carved in stone, flags fluttering. Another, newer, to the native warriors, acknowledging their victory and sacrifice. The ground tries to hold both stories at once, but you can still feel the tension, the weight of myth pressing against the weight of memory. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not glory, not tragedy, but contradiction. For the army, Little Bighorn was humiliation dressed up as heroism. For the tribes, it was triumph already shadowed by inevitable defeat. For history, it was a battle too messy to fit neatly into one narrative, so it got broken into two: the legend of Custer's last stand, and the quieter, harsher truth of a people fighting for survival. If you'd been there, if you'd died there, your bones would have been shoveled into shallow earth. Your name perhaps forgotten, your death spun into someone else's story. And centuries later, tourists would stand in the sun, mispronouncing Cheyenne, snapping photos of markers, and asking whether Custer's ghost still walks the hill. That's the final irony. You gave your life to a battle that was remembered less for what happened than for what people needed it to mean. And meaning, like the river, changes course over time. In the summer of 1876, Sitting Bull prepared his body for the kind of negotiation most politicians would never dare. He didn't sit at a desk with treaties or shuffle maps across a table. He went out into the open, under the prairie sun, stripped himself of comfort, and gave his flesh to the spirits. The sun dance wasn't a performance for outsiders, though later generations would gawk at it like some exotic punishment. It was, for the Lakota, the highest form of prayer, a way to align the body with the needs of the people. So he did what was expected of a leader in desperate times. He endured. His chest was pierced with skewers, cords tethered him to the central pole, and he danced until exhaustion blurred into trance. Blood flowed. The body became a vessel. Where others might see brutality, the Lakota saw a contract. Pain was currency. To suffer willingly was to place yourself on the line for your people, a living guarantee that the spirits would listen. Anthropologists who later scribbled about it often described the sundance in clinical tones: ritual mutilation, symbolic ordeal, missing entirely the point. For the Lakota, flesh wasn't symbolic, it was literal. The piercing wasn't a metaphor for sacrifice, it was sacrifice. And Sitting Bull wasn't staging a show. He was opening the door to visions, those rare intrusions of clarity where the human and the sacred overlap. The scene must have looked both terrifying and mesmerizing. A man tethered to wood, body swaying, eyes rolled back, surrounded by the sound of drums and songs that carried generations of memory. Dust clung to his sweat, flies hovered at the blood, and still he danced. Hours passed, maybe days. Hunger and thirst gnawed until they disappeared into something larger. And then, As always happens in these stories, the line between endurance and revelation broke. Sitting Bull fell into trance. In that altered state, the body ceased to matter. The wounds, the thirst, the exhaustion, all transformed into vision. And in that vision, he saw soldiers falling into camp like grasshoppers, tumbling headfirst, helpless, collapsing under their own weight. It wasn't a dream of victory dressed in poetry. It was a premonition, a clear picture of the future, written in metaphor vivid enough for anyone to grasp. What mattered wasn't that he had the vision. What mattered was that he had it while suspended in the most sacred of contexts, the sun dance, where blood and body speak louder than words. This wasn't private hallucination. It was divine message, sealed by pain, witnessed by the community, validated by tradition. For the Lakota, visions weren't solitary. They were binding. The irony, of course, is that the US Army dismissed such rituals as superstition, savage spectacle, meaningless agony. They preferred ink on treaties and signatures on paper. And yet, Sitting Bull's vision, earned in blood, grounded in ceremony, would soon prove far more accurate than any report filed by the Army's scouts. The cords eventually tore free, the bleeding slowed, and the man who staggered back to his people was no longer just a chief. He was the bearer of a prophecy that would mobilize thousands, inspire unity, and send Custer and the 7th Cavalry galloping toward their fate without even knowing they'd already been written into it. And visions, once spoken aloud, have a way of reshaping the world, turning belief into momentum. Which is why, in the weeks that followed, the campfires along the plains began to burn brighter. The grasshoppers fell head first. That's how Sitting Bull described it afterward. Soldiers dropping into the camp as if the sky itself had turned against them. Not disciplined ranks, not glorious charges, but insects tumbling helplessly from above. For the Lakota, this wasn't just imagery. It was a code that needed no deciphering. The dream said plainly what the elders had long whispered. The enemy would come. The enemy would break, and the enemy would be destroyed, not out there in some distant canyon, but here, inside the heart of the people's world. Visions carried weight because they were collective property. When a man spoke of what he had seen, the community gathered, measured it, tested it against their own sense of balance. In this case, nobody doubted. Sitting Bull had endured the Sundance. His body was the receipt of his promise. Blood and trance made his words more than speculation. They made them binding. And there was urgency in the way he told it. The dream was not gentle, not ambiguous. Soldiers didn't march into camp. They fell. They came not with the slow inevitability of rivers, but with the clumsy collapse of pests. That difference mattered. The vision stripped the army of its grandeur, reducing it to fragile swarms, faceless and powerless before the will of the spirits. The metaphor itself was a kind of warfare. To name the soldiers grasshoppers was to already belittle them, to deny their discipline, their rifles, their banners. Among the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the story spread like fire through dry sage. Camps echoed with the telling. Warriors painted their faces with renewed confidence. Women prepared food and clothing for long journeys. And children were told that the time was coming when the people would be tested. Prophecies weren't bedtime tales. They were orders written in symbols. Anthropologists later scribbled in notebooks that the vision boosted morale, as if it were no more than a pep talk before battle. But to those who lived inside its meaning, it was something heavier. A prophecy didn't predict, it demanded once spoken. It set expectations in motion. Men believed not that they might win, but that they must. The falling soldiers were no longer hypothetical. They were inevitable, waiting just beyond the horizon. Even the way it was remembered carries a strange, eerie resonance. The grasshoppers weren't just falling. They were falling into the camp, into the very circle of life that defined the people. It wasn't about seeking out war. It was about war seeking them. And that difference reframed everything. Instead of rebellion, it became defense. Instead of aggression, survival. The US Army never understood this part. When they heard later of Sitting Bull's vision, they smirked at superstition, dismissed it as mystical nonsense. To them, victory was measured in troop strength, ammunition, and supply lines. What they didn't grasp was how a single vision, rooted in ritual suffering, could stitch together scattered bands into something more powerful than any rifle company. The grasshoppers had not yet fallen, but the people were already preparing to meet them. The camps grew larger, fires brighter, ponies restless. Prophecy had become momentum, and momentum has a way of bending reality until it fulfills itself. And as the lodges multiplied along the Little Bighorn, the U.S. Army was marching west with the arrogance of men who thought they were the hunters. The vision was never meant to sit quietly in a corner. Once spoken, it spread through the camps like smoke carried on the prairie wind. By early summer, the Little Bighorn Valley wasn't just another seasonal gathering place. It was becoming a city, alive with thousands of people who had come because prophecy demanded it. Sitting Bull's words gave permission to hope, and hope on the plains wasn't sentimental. It was logistical. It meant, pack up your lodge, gather your horses, and join the circle. By June of 1876, bands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho were converging. It was the largest single gathering in living memory. Tipis stretching for miles along the bends of the river, smoke rising in dozens of spirals, pony herds grazing in waves across the grass. To the army, this would later be called a hostile concentration, as if people coming together to live and defend their land was somehow unnatural. To those inside the circle, it was destiny unfolding, a visible answer to the suffering endured at the sun dance. Prophecies don't just boost morale, they create obligation. A warrior who believed in the vision of falling soldiers couldn't simply stay home. The spirits had marked the path. To ignore it would have been to step aside from history, to leave your family undefended, your courage untested. And so men rode in from distant camps, painted and ready. Women carried supplies, children followed, elders sang the songs that had always accompanied journeys like this. The camp itself became a fusion of prophecy and politics. The vision said they would win, and the sheer size of the gathering made that victory seem possible. This wasn't rebellion in the way Washington understood it. It wasn't a plot or a conspiracy. It was ceremony expanding into strategy. Sitting Bull's prophecy didn't hand out tactics, but it gave something more dangerous: conviction. And conviction has a way of filling in its own details. Crazy Horse, younger, restless, already scarred from previous battles, took that conviction and sharpened it into preparation. If the soldiers were going to fall like grasshoppers, he would make sure the swarm was well directed. Meanwhile, on the horizon, the army was marching west, dividing its forces, carrying the same assumptions that had shaped every other campaign, that native resistance was scattered, temporary, unorganized. They didn't see the gathering until it was too late. Their scouts reported unusual numbers, but reports can be ignored when arrogance is already doing the math. Inside the camp, though, the numbers weren't abstract. Every new lodge raised meant another family defended, another warrior ready. Each herd added to the sense that the people were not retreating into reservation boundaries, but expanding outward, stronger together. It was a living rejection of U.S. policy, and because the vision had declared it, that rejection felt not just political, but sacred. If prophecy had teeth, this was them, the ability to move entire communities, to transform fear into preparation, to turn memory of loss into expectation of triumph. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the summer sun carried a charge. The grasshoppers would fall, and they would be ready to receive them. And while the encampment grew into something like a nation on the move, the army mistook that sound in the distance for opportunity. By the time the sun stood highest over the Little Bighorn, the valley had transformed into something astonishing, a city that wasn't supposed to exist. To outsiders, native life was imagined as scattered, a handful of lodges here, a few families there, always drifting. What the army never prepared for was the scale of unity when prophecy and politics pulled the people together. Along the river stretched more than 1,000 lodges, an expanse of hides and poles that seemed endless against the rolling grasslands. Smoke curled from cooking fires, mingling with dust raised by pony herds so large they turned the prairie into a living sea. Children ran through the camp lanes. Women tanned hides and cooked meat. Elders sat in circles telling stories, and warriors painted their faces in preparation for whatever was coming. This wasn't a ragged assembly. It was a capital, if only for a season. Anthropologists would later compare it to a marketplace or a festival, but that doesn't quite catch it. It was more like a declaration. The people weren't shrinking, weren't disappearing. They were here in numbers, in strength, in defiance. A city without stone, without walls, but alive with the kind of order that comes from shared purpose. Everywhere in that camp was evidence of the prophecy at work. The circle itself, the beating heart of Plains cosmology, had grown vast, swollen with lodges from far-flung bands. The fact that so many had come was already proof to the people that Sitting Bull's vision was real, who would risk traveling hundreds of miles if not to answer the call of destiny. Each new group that arrived was another thread woven into the fabric of inevitability. It must have been overwhelming to see. For a young warrior, the sight of thousands of allies, ponies grazing in their thousands, was a transformation of confidence. For women, the gathering was a chance to share food, song, and strength, to see that their families were not alone. For children, it was a wonder. Endless playmates, endless movement, the world suddenly wider and safer. And for leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, it was confirmation that the fight would not be one of desperation, but of abundance. The US scouts who caught glimpses of this camp were stunned. Some estimates put the warrior count at 1,500, maybe more. For comparison, Custer was riding with just over 600 men total, and his personal command barely numbered 210. In other words, the so-called hunters were outnumbered before they even knew the herd existed. But within the camp, numbers weren't calculated like the army calculated them. Each warrior wasn't just a statistic. Each family wasn't just a supply burden. They were threads in the circle, parts of the larger whole, their very presence evidence of strength. The encampment wasn't just an army waiting for battle. It was a society, humming, alive, complete. And that society was anchored in ritual as much as in preparation. Sacred pipes were smoked, songs sung, stories retold. The gathering was itself a form of resistance, living proof that the people could still be themselves, even as the buffalo thinned and reservation lines closed in. So there it stood, a living city, shimmering in heat, dense with expectation. And on the far edge of the horizon, the US Army rode toward it, blind to what awaited, convinced that what they would meet was a village, not a nation. From the Army's point of view, the summer campaign of 1876 was supposed to be straightforward. 3 columns converging from different directions, General Terry from the east, Crook from the south, Gibbon from the west, squeezing the Lakota and Cheyenne into submission. A neat little maneuver, the kind you could sketch on a map with straight lines and arrows, as if thousands of human lives behaved like chess pieces. But the first miscalculation was simple arrogance. The army thought it was dealing with scattered hostiles, a few hundred warriors at most, families clinging to the last of their independence. They didn't expect a camp of several thousand. They didn't expect unity, and they certainly didn't expect prophecy to be worth more than a supply line. Crook's column blundered first. At the Battle of the Rosebud, just days before Little Bighorn, Crazy Horse and his allies struck hard enough to send Crook retreating south, effectively removing one prong of the grand plan. Instead of warning bells ringing, the army shrugged. They still had Terry and Custer. Numbers, after all, are supposed to fix everything. Then came Custer's personal errors, though errors feels too polite. He was offered Gatling guns, cumbersome but devastating. He refused them. Too slow, too heavy, not suitable for the kind of swift victory he imagined. He was offered reinforcements. He refused those too. More men would mean less glory to divide. He chose speed, surprise, and a shot at headlines over prudence. His scouts, Crow and Arikara allies, warned him repeatedly. They'd seen the pony herds, the size of the encampment, the sheer scale of the gathering. They told him plainly, this was no small village. But warnings don't land well on ears stuffed with ambition. Custer saw the smoke rising from the lodges and thought opportunity, not doom. Even the structure of the regiment became its undoing. Dividing into 3 battalions might have looked clever on paper. Hit the camp from multiple directions, keep the enemy off balance. But dividing a force of barely 600 against a camp of thousands wasn't strategy. It was delusion. Reno was sent charging into one end of the camp. Benteen ordered off on a wide detour, and Custer himself marched north with 210 men as if destiny owed him a victory. Anthropologists looking back at this moment often point to cultural blind spots. The army measured power in rifles, artillery, and supply wagons. The Lakota and Cheyenne measured power in unity, prophecy, and mobility. Custer couldn't see the camp as anything more than a target. He couldn't grasp that the entire encampment was a functioning society, prepared to fight as one. The irony is brutal. The army's plans were written in straight lines. The Lakota's defense was written in circles. Circles move, adapt, surround. Straight lines break. On the ground, that difference would mean everything. So the army kept marching, convinced it was herding hostiles like cattle. But the grasshoppers from Sitting Bull's vision weren't cattle. They were soldiers, and they were about to fall, not with glory, not with order, but with the helplessness of men who believed their own propaganda right up until the moment the circle closed. When the dust rose over the valley on June 25, 1876, Sitting Bull's prophecy stopped being a story and started becoming choreography. Reno's battalion was first to crash into the southern edge of the camp, expecting panic. Instead, they found warriors streaming out, not scattering. Horses thundered, rifles cracked, arrows whistled. Within minutes, Reno's charge dissolved into retreat, soldiers stumbling back across the river, leaving their dead behind. The circle was already closing. Custer, further north, never saw it coming. His 210 men rode into the ridges overlooking the river, expecting to sweep down on a camp in chaos. What they saw instead was order, not military order with drums and bugles, but the organic, terrifying order of thousands, moving with shared conviction. Warriors poured out of the lodges, mounted with speed that rifles couldn't match. The swarm in Sitting Bull's vision had arrived, only it wasn't the enemy falling, not yet. Eyewitness accounts from Lakota and Cheyenne later painted the scene with unsettling clarity. Soldiers dismounted in confusion, firing volleys that cracked but didn't stop the wave. Horses screamed, men stumbled into each other, their blue uniforms a blur in the dust. Warriors rode circles, a tactic meant to draw fire and create openings. The circle moved faster than the line could adjust, and then the collapse began. Soldiers broke formation, some running, some kneeling, some firing wildly into empty air. Crazy Horse led a charge that split the line entirely, shattering whatever discipline remained. Grasshoppers falling, not in the sky this time, but across the ridge, into coulees, into the dirt, headfirst and helpless. The vision was no longer metaphor, it was spectacle. Accounts tell of soldiers fighting bravely, yes, but bravery without coherence looks like desperation. A few knelt together, reloading until the last cut down where they stood. Others fled toward the river, chased down in the dust. Some tried to hide behind fallen horses, using their mounts as barricades until they were surrounded. One survivor from the native side recalled seeing soldiers die running, not standing. What struck the warriors most wasn't resistance but fragility. The same army that burned villages, tore up treaties, and spoke of inevitable conquest folded in less than an hour. The prophecy had been cruelly precise. They fell, not marched. They tumbled, not fought. And somewhere in that chaos, Custer himself died. 2 bullet wounds, one to the chest, one to the head. His body later found stripped, his hair cropped short, left largely untouched, unlike the mutilated corpses around him. Whether by respect, contempt, or accident, the man who thought he was destiny's agent became just another fallen figure in the dust, indistinguishable from the swarm his arrogance had led. When the firing finally ceased, the silence was its own kind of roar. The ridges were strewn with blue uniforms, broken carbines, and lifeless horses. The grasshoppers had fallen exactly as the vision foretold, not gently, not symbolically, but in heaps, under a sun that made every corpse swell by the hour. For the Lakota and Cheyenne, the fulfillment of prophecy wasn't subtle. It was absolute. The spirits had spoken, and history had bent to their words. The circle had held, and the line had shattered. But fulfillment always carries an aftertaste. In the moment of triumph, there's already the shadow of what such precision demands next. When the dust cleared, the battlefield was not just a place of death, but of ritual. To the Lakota and Cheyenne, war didn't end with the last shot. It spilled over into the sacred, into acts the army would later label as atrocities, but which belonged to an entirely different grammar of warfare. Counting coup came first, the act of touching an enemy in combat, striking him with a coup, stick, whip, or bare hand. To risk yourself close enough to touch meant courage greater than killing at a distance. Warriors remembered those moments more vividly than the taking of lives. Coup wasn't about humiliation. It was about bravery, a story you could tell, a deed that carried weight in the circle of men who measured worth, not in medals but in proximity to danger. Scalping, mutilation, the removal of objects from the dead, these shocked soldiers and settlers alike. They were interpreted as savage indulgence, cruelty for cruelty's sake. But within the Plains traditions, they were acts of spiritual control. To cut the hair, to mark the body, was to weaken the enemy's spirit, to ensure it could not return to harm the living. The body was a vessel, even in death. Altering it was part of closing the battle. Rings were taken, fingers severed, uniforms stripped. These were spoils, yes, but also practical. Cloth, weapons, and jewelry carried value in societies where nothing was wasted. To leave such things behind would have been absurd. Soldiers thought their gear was sacred property of the army. To warriors, it was simply material entering a new cycle of use. And then there were the women. They were not absent from this ritual aftermath. Some struck blows against fallen soldiers, an assertion of vengeance for families lost in earlier raids, massacres, or displacements. Others helped carry out mutilations meant to neutralize the enemy's spiritual power. In Plains cosmology, the dead were not inert. They could act, linger, threaten. Ritual acts ensured they stayed where they belonged. To the army, this was desecration. To the people of the camp, it was closure. Without it, the spirits of the soldiers might wander, restless, seeking revenge. With it, the circle could continue unbroken. Anthropologists who later dissected these accounts often struggled between fascination and judgment. They catalogued the acts, drew diagrams, made lists of wounds, missing the simple point that warfare here was as spiritual as it was material. A soldier might die from a bullet, but the meaning of his death was sealed by the acts performed afterward. The difference between history and anthropology is this. History says the battle ended at a certain hour. Anthropology reminds you that battles continue in song, in memory, in the body of the dead. The irony is cruel. The very acts intended to contain the spirits of the enemy instead became fuel for vengeance. American newspapers splashed descriptions of scalping and mutilation across their pages, turning ritual into propaganda, sacred closure into justification for annihilation. What was meant to silence the dead instead gave them louder voices, amplified by hysteria and myth. And so the grasshoppers fell, yes, but in their falling, they seeded a harvest of retaliation. The spirits may have been bound, but the empire was just beginning to stir. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the battlefield was never remembered simply as a place of victory. It was layered, contradictory, pride braided with grief, triumph braided with dread. In the days after the fighting, songs were sung, not just of courage, but of loss. The names of fallen warriors were carried into the circle, honored in stories, woven into the fabric of the people. Victory had weight, but so did mourning. That's the part outsiders rarely understood. For the U.S. Army, losing a few hundred men was catastrophic in military terms, but abstract in personal ones. Replacements could always be called up from the east. For the tribes, losing even a handful of warriors was devastating. Every man was part of a network of kinship, bound to families, two stories, two roles no one else could easily fill. The greatest victory on the plains was celebrated, yes, but it was also tempered by the empty spaces left in the lodges. Still, the fulfillment of Sitting Bull's vision was undeniable. The people told the story with a sense of awe, soldiers falling like insects, just as foretold. The prophecy had not only predicted the outcome, it had confirmed the sacred order of the world. For a people told daily that their ways were doomed, their rituals meaningless, their visions foolish, Little Bighorn became a powerful rebuttal. The spirits had spoken, and the spirits had been right. Around the campfires, elders and leaders reminded the young that this was proof. The old ways still carried power. Dreams, songs, visions. These weren't relics. They were living tools, sharper than the army's sabers. For a moment, the people could believe that history had turned in their favor, that destiny might still belong to them. But even in those same stories, a shadow crept in. Some elders warned that victory this large could not stand unpunished. The army was humiliated, and humiliation breeds fury faster than defeat. The prophecy had been fulfilled, yes, but prophecies rarely tell you what comes after, and what came after was already looming like storm clouds. Anthropologists who later recorded oral traditions noticed the double note, joy laced with foreboding. Warriors spoke of bravery and triumph, but also of dreams that followed, dreams of endless soldiers marching, of buffalo vanishing, of camps breaking apart. The people understood instinctively what the army refused to, that every victory carries its own curse. For the children who lived through it, memory was seared in color and sound. The thunder of hooves, the chaos of battle, the sight of soldiers fleeing or falling. Years later, when they retold the story as elders, the details were vivid, precise, even eerie. The vision of grasshoppers wasn't just a prophecy, it had become lived experience. And lived experience turns into identity, passed forward like a scar carried by a people rather than an individual. So the aftermath in native consciousness was never simple celebration. It was survival, magnified. It was the proof that fighting back was possible, even if the cost was high. And it was a reminder that the spirits could still bend the course of history, though history itself, relentless as it is, would soon bend back. While the camps along the Little Bighorn were alive with song and sorrow, the towns back east were alive with ink. Newspapers couldn't get enough of the story, but the story they told was not the one Sitting Bull's people remembered. The US didn't want prophecy, humiliation, or tactical brilliance. It wanted myth. Within days, headlines christened the event Custer's Last Stand. The phrase alone did half the work. Noble, dramatic, self-contained. Paintings quickly followed, showing Custer tall and unbent, golden hair shining, saber raised against a sea of faceless attackers. Never mind that he'd cut his hair short before the campaign. Never mind that he was likely shot early in the fight. Myth prefers aesthetics over accuracy. Custer became both scapegoat and saint. His recklessness was acknowledged quietly, in the margins, but wrapped in so much martyrdom that it hardly mattered. He was transformed into a tragic hero, an Achilles of the prairie, brought down not by arrogance but by overwhelming odds. His men, stripped and mutilated in the dust, became icons of stoic sacrifice rather than victims of poor planning. The entire disaster was rewritten as inevitable, almost cosmic, rather than the product of arrogance and miscalculation. And the native side, that was painted in darker strokes. The massive encampment wasn't described as a community of families defending their way of life. It was a hostile village, a nest of savages who had overwhelmed civilization's vanguard. The rituals performed on the battlefield were twisted into proof of barbarity. Scalping, mutilation, even counting coup, all reinterpreted as grotesque indulgence. Stripped of context, displayed like carnival horror to stoke outrage. The myth-making wasn't sloppy, it was strategic. A nation that prided itself on expansion couldn't admit it had been outmaneuvered by people it labeled primitive. So it turned the defeat into a morality play. Brave soldiers versus ruthless hordes. Civilization versus savagery. By elevating Custer into a tragic hero and demonizing his opponents, the US not only saved face, but built the emotional scaffolding for what came next: retaliation. Anthropologists looking back can trace how myths serve empires the way rituals serve communities. For the Lakota, Sitting Bull's vision unified the people. For the United States, the myth of Custer's Last Stand unified public opinion. Both were symbolic tools, one forged in blood, the other in ink. But while the Lakota's prophecy was fulfilled in a single afternoon, the American myth stretched its influence for generations. Children grew up reciting it, textbooks enshrined it, Hollywood later polished it into spectacle. The fact that the 7th Cavalry collapsed in panic, that soldiers died running, that the native camp fought with organization and skill, all of that was quietly buried under layers of patriotic oil paint. The truth was too unsettling. Better to believe that Custer had held the hill like a martyr, and that his fall demanded vengeance. Denial worked hand in hand with myth. To admit the reality of Little Bighorn would have meant admitting the failure of US policy, the arrogance of leadership, the humanity of native resistance. Instead, the story was repackaged into something the nation could digest. Tragedy with a moral. Humiliation disguised as heroism. Loss reframed as inspiration. And once myth takes root, it doesn't stay on paper. It spills into policy, into war, into the lives of those who will soon feel the full weight of a nation nursing its pride. When the smoke finally cleared, Sitting Bull's vision stood fulfilled. But fulfillment has a way of souring into curse. The prophecy had promised soldiers would fall into camp like grasshoppers, and so they had bent. Yet instead of securing peace, that victory set in motion the very storm the people had feared. The United States could not tolerate humiliation. Little Bighorn became the wound the army itched to cauterize with fire. Within months, more columns swept into the plains, larger, better supplied, more ruthless. Crazy Horse was hunted down and killed in 1877. Sitting Bull fled north into Canada. Exile carrying the bitter taste of triumph turned to ash. By 1881, even he was forced to surrender. The buffalo herds were collapsing, agencies swelled with hunger and disease, and the living city on the Little Bighorn shrank into fragments. Anthropologists later pointed to the irony of prophecy. It binds a moment in meaning, but says nothing about what follows. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the vision had united them, emboldened them, carried them through the greatest victory against the U.S. Army. But the aftermath showed that prophecy and history move on different timelines. Spirits may guarantee a battle, but they don't guarantee a war. And yet, the story lived on. For the tribes, it was remembered in songs, in oral histories, in the pride of knowing that once, just once, the empire's might had faltered before the circle of the people. For the United States, it was remembered as tragedy, retold until Custer became a martyr, and his defeat a justification for conquest. Both memories were true in their own way, and both left scars. The legacy of the vision is this contradiction. It was both empowerment and omen. Empowerment, because it proved the old ways still held power, that blood and sacrifice could summon clarity, that prophecy could become reality. Omen, because in fulfilling itself, it invited retaliation on a scale no prophecy could deflect. By the time Sitting Bull was shot dead at Standing Rock in 1890, his vision had become history's riddle. Soldiers had fallen like grasshoppers, yes, but more soldiers came, endlessly, swarming from the east, armed not only with rifles but with laws, policies, and railroads. The nightmare wasn't the battle. The nightmare was what followed. And so the vision remains suspended in memory, a strange paradox carved into both native and American consciousness. For one afternoon, prophecy bent reality, grasshoppers fell, and the world seemed to tilt toward justice. But history tilted back, harder, and the cost was staggering. To walk the battlefield today is to feel both layers at once. White markers dot the ridges where soldiers fell, red ones now added where warriors died. The wind moves over the grass, indifferent, but the ground remembers. The story it tells is not of glory, nor even of defeat, but of vision and nightmare entwined. A reminder that what is foretold may come true, but never without a price. In the years after the Civil War, George Armstrong Custer became less of a man and more of a poster. He had charged at Gettysburg, strutted in parades, and cultivated that absurdly golden hair like it was a flag of its own. Newspapers adored him, politicians used him, and his troops both admired and loathed him in the way men do when they're stuck under a commander who seems to believe he's starring in an opera. Custer wasn't just an officer, he was a brand, and like most brands, he believed his own advertising. The Army had convinced itself of another myth as well, the so-called invincibility of American expansion. Every battle on the frontier was framed as foregone. How could ragged bands of hostiles stand against rifles, sabers, and flags carried from Washington? That confidence was not just arrogance, it was policy. Treaties were written with ink that dried faster than promises, and every push into native lands carried the assumption that resistance would collapse under pressure. The 7th Cavalry marched west in 1876, with this air of inevitability trailing behind them like dust. They carried memories of past campaigns, where smaller groups of Lakota or Cheyenne had scattered before concentrated firepower. They carried the belief that native communities were fractured, incapable of unity, and destined to fade. And above all, they carried the myth of their commander's genius, that somehow Custer's flair for drama equaled strategy. He played into it shamelessly. He wore buckskins instead of the standard blue, as if auditioning for the role of frontier demigod. His speeches dripped with confidence, his reports inflated victories, and his very appearance was cultivated to look more like destiny than like a soldier. Arrogance wasn't just personal style, it was doctrine. When you've been fed the story that you're the inevitable wave of history, you start to believe bullets are just punctuation. But myths have a way of making people careless. Custer refused Gatling guns because they slowed him down. He declined reinforcements because he wanted the glory unshed. He treated warnings from scouts as noise to be brushed aside. Invincibility doesn't need caution, it needs theater. And so he marched, not into a balanced contest, but into a disaster waiting politely behind the ridges. Anthropologists might point out that this wasn't just military hubris, but cultural blindness. The Army couldn't see the plains as anything but empty space waiting to be filled, couldn't see native societies as anything but fragments. The idea that thousands could gather into a city along the river, that prophecy and ritual could bind warriors more tightly than chains of command ever did, was unthinkable. And when something is unthinkable, it's invisible, until it knocks you flat. Custer's legend was supposed to end with triumph, with cavalry flags flying over subdued lodges. Instead, it collided with a reality much larger than his ego. But at the start, all anyone in the 7th Cavalry carried was the conviction that their commander's luck would hold, and that history was on their side. Invincibility wasn't just a feeling, it was the script. And scripts, once written, tend to unravel the moment the actors forget that the stage doesn't always obey. Along the Little Bighorn River in June 1876, the army thought it would find a village. What it found instead was something closer to a city, a seasonal capital pulled together, not by walls or stone, but by ritual, prophecy, and necessity. More than 1,000 lodges stretched across the valley, smoke rising in dozens of spirals, pony herds grazing in their thousands. At its height, estimates say 7,000 to 8,000 people were there. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho families gathered in defiance of the reservation system that had tried to box them in. The army had been told. Crow and Arikara scouts, men who knew the land and the patterns of movement, warned repeatedly of unusual size. They saw the endless pony herds, the sheer scale of the lodges. They said plainly, this was no ordinary village. But those warnings fell against ears trained to dismiss native reports as exaggerations. To the 7th Cavalry, a large village meant perhaps a few hundred lodges, a manageable enemy. What waited at the Little Bighorn was 3 times that number. From the native perspective, the gathering was not chaos, but structure. The circle of the camp itself, tipis arranged in order by band, families living in proximity to kin, was a reflection of social organization. Every lodge had its place, every fire its role. The camp was both home and statement. The people were not scattered fragments, but a body still whole. To walk through it was to feel both abundance and purpose. Women cooked, tanned hides, prepared clothing. Children played, elders told stories. And always, warriors kept watch, mounted and ready, painted with symbols of dreams and visions. Anthropologists often call these encampments aggregations, as if they were accidents of migration. But this one was deliberate. Prophecy had pulled the people together, Sitting Bull's vision of falling soldiers adding a layer of destiny to the gathering. It wasn't just practical defense, it was spiritual obligation. Families came because they believed they were meant to, because to ignore the vision would be to step out of balance with the world. To the U.S. military mind, however, such unity was unimaginable. Native groups were assumed to be fractured, incapable of sustained cohesion. Policy relied on it, treaties with one band while pressuring another, starvation rations to force compliance, endless talk of hostiles and friendlies, as though they were tidy categories. The sight of thousands camped together shattered that assumption. But by the time Custer's scouts reported it, arrogance had already written the script. The encampment was not a defensive crouch, but an assertion. It said plainly, the people would not vanish quietly into agencies, nor trade the Black Hills for government rations. It was a city of resistance, breathing with the rhythms of ceremony and war preparation. What Custer and his men rode toward was not an undefended target, but a community large enough to resist, confident enough to fight, and unified by belief that history itself had tilted in their favor. The army called it a hostile concentration. To those inside the circle, it was life at its fullest. Children laughing, fires crackling, horses restless, warriors ready. And when a myth of invincibility meets a reality this large, the gap doesn't just crack, it collapses. A few weeks before the valley filled with lodges, Sitting Bull had already given the people something rarer than food or ammunition: certainty. During the sundance he had fasted, bled, and swayed, tethered to the central pole until his body gave way to vision. What he saw wasn't metaphor dressed for poetry. It was soldiers falling headfirst into the camp like grasshoppers, helpless, tumbling, destined to be swallowed by the dust. Among the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, visions weren't personal hallucinations. They were public property, tested and carried into the circle. To bleed in ritual, to collapse in trance, meant you weren't inventing a story. You were channeling a message, and Sitting Bull's message was clear enough that no one mistook it. The enemy would come, the enemy would fall, and the spirits themselves had promised it. The timing mattered. Reservation agents and soldiers had been pressing harder, cutting off rations, threatening arrests, tightening the boundaries of movement. The people needed something more than defiance. They needed proof that the old ways still worked. And here it was, delivered through ritual sacrifice, carved into memory by the spectacle of blood on the prairie and the body swaying against cords of flesh. The vision wasn't symbolic, it was binding. Anthropologists who later wrote about it often reduced it to boosted morale, as if it were no more than a pep talk before a football game. But morale doesn't move thousands of people across hundreds of miles. Prophecy does. Families packed their lodges not because it might be a good fight, but because they believed destiny had already declared victory. Confidence was no longer an emotion, it was obligation. That certainty transformed preparation. Warriors painted their faces not with desperation, but with expectation. They rode into the valley believing not only in their own skill, but in the inevitability of triumph. Women prepared food, cared for children, and supported the gathering not in fear but in shared conviction. Even children felt it, running between tipis, listening to the retellings of the vision, knowing that history was about to bend in their favor. For the U.S. Army, this kind of belief was invisible. Soldiers marched on rations and supply lines. Generals moved pawns across maps. They couldn't conceive of prophecy as a weapon sharper than a saber. They called it superstition, dismissed it as primitive mysticism. Yet on the ground, that mysticism was forging unity far stronger than any military order. It stitched together bands that might otherwise have scattered, binding them with expectation that their victory had already been seen. So when the scouts peered down into the valley and saw thousands of lodges, what they were really seeing was prophecy made physical, the translation of a vision into a living, breathing army. Every fire that burned, every herd that grazed, every warrior who sharpened a lance was part of that unfolding certainty. And prophecy, once set loose, doesn't just sit still. It accelerates, pushing people into motion. The soldiers were already riding west, convinced they would crush a village. The people in the valley were already convinced the soldiers would fall. When two worlds carry such incompatible certainties, the meeting point isn't negotiation, it's collision. The 7th Cavalry marched toward the Little Bighorn, not with caution, but with theater. Every choice in the days before the fight reads less like strategy and more like an audition for immortality. Custer was offered Gatling guns, cumbersome, yes, but capable of cutting swaths through masked warriors. He refused. Too slow, too heavy, not glamorous enough for the kind of victory he wanted to stage. He was offered extra men. He refused those too. More troops meant less glory to divide. He believed in speed, surprise, and his own uncanny luck. That formula had worked before in smaller fights. Why not now? The problem was scale. The enemy was not a scattering of lodges, but a city of thousands, and speed only meant arriving faster to disaster. Then came the division of forces. On paper, it looked bold. Split the regiment into 3 wings, strike from different directions, keep the enemy off balance. In practice, it meant diluting barely 600 men against perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 warriors. Reno would attack one end of the camp. Benteen was sent off on a wide detour. Custer himself rode north with 210 men, convinced the encirclement would work. Splitting a regiment against a city is not encirclement, it's wishful thinking. Scouts warned him. Crow and Arikara allies pointed to the dust of massive pony herds, to the sheer size of the encampment. They begged him to reconsider. Some accounts say they wept, knowing what was about to unfold. But Custer dismissed them. The army's cultural blind spot was showing. Native warnings were often seen as exaggeration, their intelligence discounted as superstition. When arrogance has already written the script, advice is just background noise. Anthropologists later noted the clash of worldviews here. The army thought in lines, maps, and formations. Straight charges, flanking maneuvers, pinning the enemy. The Lakota and Cheyenne thought in circles, encirclement, mobility, fluidity. A circle adapts, a line breaks. By splitting his command, Custer left each wing too weak to stand and too far to reinforce. He had turned the regiment into disconnected lines, facing a people whose strength lay in closing circles. Even the psychology of the plan carried fatal flaws. Soldiers expected to ride down a village, frightening women and children into flight, scattering warriors in disorder. Instead, they found warriors pouring out in numbers that seemed impossible. The assumption of panic became the reality of resistance. And in that moment, the neat little arrows on Custer's map dissolved into chaos. The irony is sharp. The man chasing personal glory ended up delivering national humiliation. His strategy wasn't military innovation but vanity disguised as confidence. Every refusal of reinforcements, of artillery, of caution, was a wager that destiny played favorites. But destiny had already been claimed in another camp, through a vision carved into flesh and blood. So Custer's men rode forward, flags flying, carbines ready, convinced they were bringing history with them. What they were really bringing was division, arrogance, and a playbook better suited to parades than to the largest native encampment on the plains. And when the 1st Battalion charged, expecting a village to scatter, it met a different kind of order entirely. The first real crack in the performance came not with Custer, but with Major Marcus Reno. His battalion was sent to strike the southern end of the encampment, where dust, fires, and children's shouts painted a picture of vulnerability. Reno charged with around 140 men, expecting chaos. What he met was something far less theatrical: organized resistance. At first, warriors scattered in apparent panic, the kind of sight cavalry officers had been trained to expect. But this retreat was not fear, it was invitation. Within minutes, riders began pouring out of the lodges. Lakota and Cheyenne mounted on fast ponies, painted, armed, and furious. Reno's men had charged into a hornet's nest, and instead of collapsing, the swarm gathered. Accounts from the soldiers are telling. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, arrows fell in waves, and the cavalry line began to bend. What was supposed to be shock and awe turned into confusion and panic. Reno's men tried forming a skirmish line, carbines cracking into the mass of warriors, but the camp itself kept producing fighters, as if the earth had decided to manufacture them on the spot. Reno suddenly realized that what he thought was the flank of a village was more like the edge of a continent. The retreat began chaotically. Reno ordered his men back into the timber along the river, hoping for cover. It was a defensive crouch, not a continuation of the bold assault. The timber gave some protection, but warriors pressed in tighter, circling, firing, shouting. Horses screamed, men fell, discipline dissolved. Then came the river crossing. Reno's men bolted, many in full panic, splashing through the water under fire. Cavalrymen tumbled, drowned, or were cut down in the shallows. Survivors scrambled up the bluffs, exhausted, humiliated, already convinced they had seen hell itself. Reno lost nearly a quarter of his battalion in less than an hour, and his men were left shaken, hiding on the high ground, trying to reassemble. The psychological fracture was deeper than the physical losses. Cavalry doctrine assumed native resistance would break under charge and gunfire. Instead, it was the soldiers who broke first. The image of white cavalry superiority cracked under the sound of war cries echoing through the valley. Anthropologists later described the encounter as a moment of inversion. Ritual warfare on the plains often emphasized daring, speed, and bravery, values suddenly being practiced not by soldiers in blue but by warriors in paint. Soldiers accustomed to thinking of native tactics as scattered raiding now saw them unified, relentless, swarming. The cultural script flipped, and the army had no rehearsal for that play. Meanwhile, the warriors' confidence only grew. Reno's collapse was proof that Sitting Bull's vision was unfolding as promised. Soldiers were falling, not as disciplined armies, but as frightened men. Every shot fired, every cavalryman fleeing up the bluffs, fed the certainty that destiny was indeed on their side. Reno's shattered command dug in, clinging to the heights, but the momentum of the battle had already shifted. What was supposed to be the opening act of Custer's encirclement had become the first chapter of rout, and while Reno's men sat gasping on the bluffs, Custer and his 210 soldiers were already riding deeper into the jaws of the camp, unaware that the line had broken and the circle was closing. Custer never saw Reno's retreat. By the time Reno's men were scrambling up the bluffs, Custer was already riding north with his 210, convinced the encampment could still be struck like a hammer shattering glass. What he was riding into was more like iron, fluid, mobile, and already aware of his approach. Scouts had seen his dust. Riders had carried word. The village was not fleeing. It was unfolding, warriors streaming out in waves, drawn by prophecy and opportunity alike. Custer's force moved along the ridges, looking for a way down into the camp, but every path seemed to sprout warriors, Lakota and Cheyenne fighters, mounted on ponies faster and more agile than the cavalry horses. darted in and out, firing, retreating, pressing closer. Custer's skirmish lines tried to form, carbines snapping, but the circle tightened. Crazy Horse's charge would become the pivot. Accounts describe him riding with fierce calm, guiding warriors directly into the flanks of Custer's men. Where soldiers tried to stand, chargers broke their lines. Where they tried to retreat, riders cut them off. The cavalry's discipline fractured into clumps, knots of men firing desperately, others stumbling toward higher ground. The terrain offered little mercy. Ravines and ridges trapped soldiers into pockets. Visibility vanished behind dust and smoke. The idea of holding a defensive line dissolved into clusters of men surrounded on all sides. Some fired until their carbines jammed with powder fouling. Others threw down weapons and tried to run, only to be cut down in the open. For the warriors, this was not just battle but vindication. They had been told the soldiers would fall like grasshoppers. And here it was, men tumbling from horses, collapsing in the grass, their bright blue uniforms stark against the earth. The circle of encirclement was more than tactic. It was fulfillment. The psychological reversal deepened. Cavalry training had drilled obedience, formations, volley fire. But in the chaos, those tools became useless. Communication broke. Trumpets were drowned by war cries, and Custer's voice, wherever it carried, could not knit the fragments together. Soldiers fought as individuals now, not as regiment. And against a force fighting with fluid unity, individuals were already dead men. Anthropologists later noted how the encirclement reflected plains warfare philosophy, mobility, coordination through kinship bonds, the merging of spiritual certainty with tactical daring. Warriors didn't need bugles, they needed vision and momentum. Custer's men, meanwhile, discovered what it meant to be prey. The speed of collapse astonished even survivors watching from Renault's bluffs. Smoke rose, shots echoed, then silence. It hadn't taken hours of disciplined exchange, it had taken minutes of chaos. Custer's entire command, officers, troopers, scouts, even the band was swallowed whole. And when the dust settled, the myth of invincibility lay in pieces beside the bodies. Soldiers who thought themselves the edge of empire had become the proof of prophecy. The circle had closed, and nothing remained but silence, dust, and the shocking emptiness of defeat. But defeat on this scale never ends with silence alone. What came after the rituals of war, the marks left on both ears, the symbols carved into memory, would ensure that the shock of the massacre spread far beyond the valley. When the last shots cracked and the dust began to settle, the battlefield did not instantly dissolve into quiet. For the warriors, the moment after victory was not the end but the extension of combat into ritual. On the plains, war was never just about killing. It was about balance, meaning, and the translation of triumph into symbols that lived beyond the moment. And so the bodies of Custer and his men became texts, written upon with knives, paint, and memory. Counting coup came first. Warriors touched fallen soldiers, sometimes with weapons, sometimes with bare hands, claiming honor for striking the enemy without needing to kill. It was bravery measured, not in numbers of dead, but in proximity to danger. Scalps were taken, not out of mindless cruelty but as trophies, proofs of courage, each one tied to a personal ledger of deeds. To the U.S. press, such acts became evidence of savagery. To the warriors, they were the currency of valor. Mutilation followed, shocking to soldiers' families when described later, but deeply embedded in the spiritual framework of plains warfare. Cutting the muscles of arms or legs, slashing the face, piercing the body, these were not random acts. They carried symbolic weight, to weaken the enemy in the afterlife, to prevent a spirit from taking revenge, to mark the battlefield as a place of power. Women, too, participated, sometimes striking blows against bodies to avenge their own losses. Custer himself was found stripped, pierced, and marked, though notably not scalped. Stories suggest that Sitting Bull's vision and Custer's symbolic role made his body different, treated with a mixture of desecration and restraint. But the majority of his men bore the full force of ritual marking. Their bodies, left under the scorching sun, swelled and darkened, grotesque in the heat. By the time U.S. troops returned to bury them days later, they were nearly unrecognizable, bloated reminders of how quickly flesh surrenders to time and temperature. Anthropologists often remark that such rituals were not unique to the plains. Across cultures, fallen enemies are transformed into canvases for meaning. But in the American imagination, The sight of mutilated cavalrymen became fuel for outrage, justification for retribution. The army framed it as proof of barbarity, conveniently ignoring the cultural codes that had guided the acts. What was ritual for one side became atrocity for the other. The battlefield itself became sacred in its own way. Warriors later spoke of visions there, of spirits walking among the dead, of voices carried on the wind. To them, the victory was not just military but cosmological proof that the world's order had bent, if only briefly, in their favor. The rituals ensured that the battle was not forgotten, not reduced to numbers, but embedded in memory as something larger, a moment where prophecy, bravery, and vengeance merged. And yet, for all the power of those rituals, they also guaranteed the fury of the United States. Families back east would not understand symbols, only scars. Officers would not explain coup, only corpses. What had been sacred gestures on the prairie would be painted as horrors in the press. And from that mismatch of meanings, the fire of retaliation began to spark. But before the reprisals, before the myth-making and the propaganda, the question lingered. Was this truly a battle? Or had it become something darker, the massacre no one had expected? From the Army's point of view, what happened on June 25, 1876, quickly stopped looking like a battle and began to resemble a massacre. 210 men under Custer's direct command were wiped out to the last soldier. Not a single bugler, not a single orderly, not even the cook survived to explain what happened. The silence of annihilation rattled military pride harder than the bullets ever had. Yet for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, this was no massacre. It was the fulfillment of defense, the repelling of invasion, the victory that had been promised by vision. A massacre suggests one-sided slaughter. What actually happened was a meeting of two forces, one arrogant and divided, the other united and prepared, and the predictable collapse of the weaker plan. If it looked lopsided, that was only because arrogance had done half the work before a shot was fired. Numbers tell the story more starkly. Custer's immediate command numbered about 210. The warriors facing him ranged from 1,500 to perhaps 2,000, drawn from multiple tribes, fighting with rifles, bows, and lances, and mounted on ponies far more maneuverable than cavalry horses. The ratio alone made survival unlikely. To call it massacre ignores the reality that this was the largest gathering of native fighters ever assembled on the plains, and that the U.S. Army walked straight into it without hesitation. The scene afterward reinforced the word massacre. Bodies lay scattered across the ridges, stripped, swollen in the summer sun, marked by ritual mutilation. To Eastern eyes, it was horror. But the ritual work of coup counting, scalping, and marking the dead was not excess but code, proof of bravery, a way of crippling enemy spirits, acts embedded in cultural frameworks that the army refused to see. What they called mutilation was, to the victors, part of making sense of the battle's meaning. Anthropologists like to point out the double standard. When Union armies burned towns in the Civil War, it was called strategy. When U.S. forces starved native communities into surrender by killing buffalo herds, it was called progress. But when native warriors marked bodies according to their ritual obligations, it was called atrocity. Massacre became the word of choice, not because the battle was one-sided, but because the outcome was intolerable. And so, the question remains, was Little Bighorn a massacre? In the military sense, it was a defeat, catastrophic and total for one battalion. In the cultural sense, it was a ritualized battle fought with codes, as real as any drill manual. In the political sense, it became propaganda, painted as savagery to fuel retaliation. The word massacre did its work. It justified new campaigns, harsher terms, a final drive to break the plains. It took one of the few native victories and turned it into the very pretext for their undoing. That irony, that winning the battle ensured losing the war, still hangs over the story like smoke. And yet, before the Incan headlines reframed it, before generals swore vengeance and reporters drew lurid sketches, what stood in the valley was simpler, the collapse of a myth of invincibility. But collapse never stays quiet for long. From silence came stories, from stories came legends, and from legends came the myth-making that reshaped memory itself. The smoke hadn't even cleared from the valley before the machinery of myth began to spin. In the Army's reports and the press back east, the disaster at the Little Bighorn was quickly transformed from humiliating defeat into legend. Custer's last stand, the phrase itself, did the heavy lifting. It turned panic into heroism, collapse into martyrdom, and a reckless gamble into a noble sacrifice. Paintings followed, dime novels, lithographs sold for pennies. Custer was shown standing tall, saber gleaming, hair golden in the sun, surrounded by loyal men fighting to the last. It looked less like a battle and more like a Renaissance martyrdom scene, with cavalrymen glowing under divine light. What these images left out, the chaos, the rout, the mutilations, the sheer scale of native numbers, was not accidental. Memory, in American hands, needed to cleanse the mess. For the native victors, memory took a different shape. Songs were sung, stories told around fires, recounting Crazy Horse's charge, Sitting Bull's vision, the way Reno's men broke and Custer's men fell. Oral tradition preserved the battle not as myth, but as lived proof that the people had once turned back an empire. It was pride, yes, but also warning. Victories were fleeting, and retaliation was certain. The two memories ran parallel, rarely touching. On one side, Little Bighorn became a story of martyrdom and revenge, used to fuel new campaigns against native communities. On the other, it remained a story of fulfillment, prophecy, and the last great victory before collapse. Both sides mythologized, but for different reasons, one to cover humiliation, the other to preserve dignity. Anthropologists have pointed out that memory always serves power. The US could not tolerate an image of soldiers cut down by savages, so it rewrote them into heroes holding the line of civilization. Native memory, stripped of monuments and state sanction, lived in the intangible words, songs, rituals. One was carved into marble, the other breathed through voices. Even the battlefield became a canvas for competing narratives. White markers now dot the ridges where soldiers fell, neat rows of stone suggesting order where there had been chaos. Red markers added much later, note where warriors died, small corrections to a story long dominated by one side. The land itself remembers both, but tourists often remember only the version with bugles and last stands. The irony is sharp. The very battle that proved native strength was transformed into propaganda for their destruction. Custer's death, framed as heroic, justified the crushing of the Lakota and Cheyenne in the years that followed. The last stand myth erased the tactical brilliance of the warriors, the cultural power of prophecy, and the sheer arrogance that had led the 7th Cavalry into disaster. What survived in popular imagination was not reality, but theater. Yet myths have their own power. They outlive facts, feed textbooks, inspire films. Children learned of Custer as a tragic hero long before they learned of Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse. And in that asymmetry lies the quiet violence of memory, the ability to shape how defeat is remembered, how victory is silenced, and how history becomes less about what happened than about who gets to tell the story. But memory doesn't stop with monuments or headlines. It lingers, reshapes, mutates. And in the aftermath of Little Bighorn, memory carried not just myth, but also vengeance. A legacy that would fall hardest on the very people who had fought to preserve their world. Victory at the Little Bighorn should have bought time. Instead, it bought the opposite. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the triumph was real, but it was also the last of its kind. The United States could not tolerate humiliation on that scale, not when a Civil War hero lay dead in the dust with every man under his command. Defeat demanded vengeance, and vengeance arrived quickly. Within weeks, fresh columns of soldiers swept into the plains, not divided and arrogant, but reinforced, supplied, and ruthless. By winter, campaigns were burning villages, slaughtering pony herds, and cutting deep into the food base of the plains people. The buffalo, already collapsing under commercial hunting, disappeared almost completely. Hunger became a sharper weapon than rifles. The great encampments that had defied the reservation system were forced, one by one, to surrender. Crazy Horse was killed in 1877. Sitting Bull fled north into Canada, clinging to exile before finally surrendering in 1881. The people scattered to agencies, confined, rationed, watched. The Little Bighorn had been a vision fulfilled, but fulfillment had a cost. It drew the wrath of a nation bent on erasing the very possibility of resistance. In an irony thick enough to taste, victory became the prelude to annihilation. Anthropologists often describe it as a turning point, the last great stand of native unity on the northern plains, the unity that Sitting Bull's prophecy had forged, could not hold against an industrial state with railroads, repeating rifles, and endless manpower. The United States could lose a battle. It could not afford to lose the narrative. So the battle was rebranded as Last Stand. The army doubled its efforts, and the plains became a cage. But legacy doesn't vanish neatly. For native communities, the memory of the victory remained a point of pride, carried in stories, songs, and the knowledge that once, against impossible odds, the empire had faltered. For the US, the legacy became paradoxical. Humiliation turned into propaganda. Defeat recast as justification for conquest. Custer's death, sanctified in myth, helped fuel the final crushing of the very people who had defeated him. The battlefield itself became haunted ground. Markers stand where soldiers fell, white stones scattered like frozen echoes. Only in recent decades have red markers been added for native dead, small acts of correction against centuries of erasure. To walk there is to feel two histories layered uncomfortably together, one of glory wrapped in denial, the other of victory wrapped in loss. And in the long shadow of that valley, the word massacre still hangs awkwardly. To the army, it explained away defeat. To the victors, it was simply battle, the defense of home, the proof of prophecy. The truth lies somewhere in the tension between them, a lopsided clash born of arrogance, carried by vision, and remembered in ways that suited power. In the end, the legacy of Little Bighorn is not just the fall of Custer, or the brilliance of native resistance. It's the way history punishes winners and redeems losers. The way myth can flip defeat into glory and victory into tragedy. And somewhere between the markers on the ridges and the stories told by firesides, the echoes of that day still argue with each other about what it meant, about who was saved, and about who, in the end, was lost.